Thank you so much, ladies. A couple of years ago, I think it was now, this summer, I was sitting at my desk one day and my cell phone rings. And I don't recognize the number. It's got some out of area code. And I answer it, and this person, it's a lady that is on the other end of the phone, and she says that she is with Goldman Sachs calling about the loan that I have applied for. Now, first of all, let me just say this. We are regularly getting cell phone calls now, stacks of them, where you're kind of always on guard because if you don't recognize the number, odds are it's someone calling you about what? Your extended car warranty. And right, I mean, and those calls are coming from the devil himself. And so they're straight up, and then they call you. All right, so there's those. And then, thankfully, right now, we're kind of out of a political season. But if it's not someone trying to talk to you about your car's extended warranty, it's some sort of political robocall. And so I'm kind of skeptical of most times that the phone would ring, and I don't know who it is. But this woman says that she is with Goldman Sachs, and there's not like a Goldman Sachs location anywhere around here, so I'm kind of skeptical. And she's saying something about a loan that I had applied for, and so I'm leery. Am I going to say anything that might share with her some information that I don't want to? And so I just said simply, I haven't applied for any loan with Goldman Sachs. I haven't applied for a loan with anyone. And she said that's kind of what I suspected, and that's actually why I'm calling. She said, I'm actually calling with the fraud department of Goldman Sachs, and someone has used your Social Security number and your birth date, and they have applied for a loan, and there was something about it that just caused a red flag, and we wanted to reach out to you to verify some information. And so it turns out, long story short, what had happened is that, I don't know, you remember seeing this in the news a couple of years ago. Was it Equifax had a data breach of 100 million Americans? Well, I'd received notification I was one of those 100 million Americans. And so, and what do they give you? So sad. Oops. Anyway, so my information is out there, and apparently what is going on is that someone had my information and went to a website called NerdWallet, and in a day applied for 9 different loans from different banks. And so I talked to this fraud investigator from Goldman Sachs. I said, what do I need to do? She said, get a copy of your credit report and see what's going on, and then contact each of those individual banks and let them know, hey, this is all fraudulent. And so I got to spend the next couple of days making a whole stack of phone calls, talking to people to say, hey, I saw that you have received this information from me, but I'm just telling you, that is not me. I have had my identity stolen. I've had my identity stolen. Hold that thought for just a moment. Since early April, we've been in a series that I have been calling Identity. Who do you think you are? And what we've been thinking about is this, that as a follower of Jesus, there are a whole slew of things that are true of you because of having a personal relationship with Him. There are some significant realities that have become realities for you. Jamie alluded to one earlier, that you have been adopted into the family of God, that you're not estranged from Him. And there are all of these realities that become true of you, and there are all these blessings that become your own personal experience. But what I want you to realize is this, that while all of this is part of your spiritual identity, it's possible for your spiritual identity to effectively be stolen, to be hijacked. Now, for me, when my identity was stolen, what did I do? The way I guarded myself against that was to put a total freeze on my credit. I couldn't borrow lunch money if I needed to right now because everything is locked down. Nobody with my Social Security number and birth date, I can't get credit right now without unlocking that freeze. That's how I guard against financial identity theft. But spiritual identity theft, how in the world can you guard against that? Thankfully, God has answered, I believe, that question for us as we continue our way in Ephesians today with Ephesians chapter 5. If you would join me there, and we're going to start reading in verse 1, seeking to answer the question again about how it is that I can guard myself against spiritual identity theft. Ephesians 5, starting with verse 1, Paul says this, "Therefore, be imitators of God as dearly loved children, and walk in love as Christ also loved us and gave Himself for us, a sacrificial and fragrant offering to God. But sexual immorality and any impurity or greed, it shouldn't be found. It should not be heard of among you, as is proper for saints. Obscene and foolish talking or crude joking are not suitable, but rather giving thanks. For know and recognize this: every sexual immoral or impure or greedy person who is an idolater does not have an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty arguments, for God's wrath is coming on the disobedient because of these things. Therefore, don't become their partners. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists of all goodness, righteousness, and truth, testing what is pleasing to the Lord. Don't participate in the fruitless works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it's shameful even to mention what is done by them in secret. Everything exposed by the light is made visible, for what makes everything visible is light. Therefore it is said, "Get up, sleeper, and rise up from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." All right, that's a whole mouthful of words there. But I believe in this whole mouthful of words, we get an answer to the question, which again is this: as a follower of Christ, there are a whole slew of things that are true of me about my identity as a follower of Jesus, but that could effectively be stolen. So how can I guard against it? The first thing that you and I need to do is this. I need to evaluate who you imitate. Evaluate who you imitate. Last week we were in chapter 4, and one of the things that we noted is that Paul was describing the work, the life that you and I, or anybody in a relationship with Christ, what things looked like before we came to know Jesus. And he characterized the difference that is the case once we begin a relationship with Him. And he describes and uses language like this, that in Jesus you are now a new person, and are described as, in verse 24 of chapter 4, as a new self that is created, Paul says, according to God's likeness in righteousness and purity of truth. That is contrasted against the person that you were before you came to know Christ, which he described as this. That type of life, that type of behavior looks like where lying is commonplace. Anger is not kept in check. Taking things that do not belong to you is common. Using foul language, making slanderous comments, being less than kind, compassionate, and forgiving. That's what Paul has just said at the end of chapter 4. That characterizes the distinction between those that know Jesus and those that have yet to come to know Him. And so with all of that as background, he comes in verse 1 of chapter 5 and says this: "Now I want you to do this. Make sure that you are," he gives an imperative, a command, "be imitators of God." Now it's interesting, he doesn't simply say, "Be imitators of God," period. Because it could be a statement just, this is what you've got to do. Why? Because I said so. Be imitators of God. But he doesn't say that. He says, "Be imitators of God as dearly loved children." Be imitators of God as dearly loved children. The extent to which you've considered this, I don't know, but the reality is that every person that is a parent or ever will become a parent is, in very significant ways, a reflection of their parents. And that actually can cut one of a couple of different ways. Some of you, and it's unfortunate, but I'm certain there are some here today who had a mom or a dad or both that is not in the Hall of Fame. And maybe they were abusive to you, maybe physically, perhaps verbally. Maybe you had a parent that was completely absent. And maybe if they were in the home that they worked so much that it was clear that was the priority. Maybe it was that you had a mom or dad that was addicted to either drugs or alcohol. Maybe you had a mom or dad that was unfaithful to their spouse, and you saw what that did to your family. And so you have experienced all of these things, and you observed that from your parents. And so now, as a parent yourself, what you have decided is this: I want to make sure that all of that stuff, I don't do any of it. I don't want to replicate, I don't want to mirror, I don't want to imitate any of that. I want to do things intentionally different. So some of you, unfortunately, are in that category. Others, hopefully the majority, are in a different category, one that I am in. I had a great dad. I have a wonderful mother. And I'm not suggesting at all that they were or are anything, that they're not perfect, because there's not a perfect mom or dad. But the reality is that my sister and I grew up in a home where we were meaningfully and sacrificially loved and cared for and disciplined and guided and trained and shepherded, and we were all of those things. And so in many ways, the type of dad that I am is a reflection of this reality, that I have experienced firsthand what it is like to be loved and cared for and provided for, and I want to make sure that I do that same thing as a dearly loved child. So I am replicating that, not simply because I'm told to do this, but because I have experienced this. I want to then mirror that. It's that same thought that Paul is appealing to here. He's saying, I want you to be an imitator of God as what? As a dearly loved child. There are so many things that you have experienced, countless blessings that you have experienced because you've crossed the threshold and begun a relationship with Christ. You have experienced firsthand the blessings that come from being in a relationship with the Lord. And because of that, the encouragement is that you ought to then replicate how it is that He operates. Now, it is not simply that we need to be encouraged to intentionally imitate God, but to also do so realizing that while every single one of us is unique, none of us is a complete original. You say, well, I don't know. Well, by that I mean this. In virtually every aspect of life, you and I are modeling and demonstrating the influence that others have had on our lives. For example, the manner in which you cook. If you cook at all, it's likely that maybe there was someone special in your life that showed you how to cook something in particular. The hairstyle that you have. Maybe it is that you have the hairstyle that you have because you saw someone that had hair like this. The music that you listen to, the way in which you play an instrument, perhaps even the way it is that you are typing on a keyboard, all of these things are demonstrating the fact that someone has had an influence in your life, and you and I are regularly replicating that. We are imitating those influences. And what I have to do then as a follower of Christ is to start with this premise. As a follower of Jesus, as someone that has a relationship with Him, He's done these amazing and great things for me. And one of the things that I want to do is to make sure that my life is one that reflects that. So that in a slew of different ways, I am demonstrating the influence that others have had on my life. But if there is anything that is true of me, if there's anything that someone sees of me, I want them to see, hey, I am seeking to imitate the one that I'm in a relationship with. I want to be an imitator of Christ. I want to intentionally do this. I want to evaluate sincerely who and what it is that I am imitating. You know, one of the things that I want to make sure that I do, and I don't go to Target that often, but if I go to Target, something I make sure I don't do, and that's this: wear a red shirt. Does that happen to you? You're on an aisle and you're looking for something, and you're struggling to find it, and so there's someone who's got their back to you and they've got a red shirt on. You say, "Excuse me," and about that time they turn and you realize they don't have a name tag on, that they're just kind of like you. But you're getting ready to call out to them. Why? Because you think they're an employee. Why? Because they have that red shirt on. I want to make sure that I don't do that. I want to make sure that I don't operate that way, because I am wanting to be careful about what it is that I am reflecting. I don't want to look like a Target employee if I'm not a Target employee. Now, as a follower of Jesus, I want to make sure that I am reflecting the fact that He has had and made a significant difference in my life. And Paul says, God says the way that I can do that is to imitate Him. Listen, you are imitating a slew of people in your life, a slew of different influences. But let me ask you, if you have a relationship with Jesus, can anyone who is paying attention to your life recognize the influence and see the manner in which you are operating like Him? If that is not to be found, let me help you realize this, that who you are as a follower of Jesus by your own choices is being stolen from you. You want to guard against that, and one of the ways that you can is to intentionally imitate the one who has done these amazing and wonderful things for you. Evaluate who you imitate. But he encourages us to do something else, which is this: avoid the spiritually deceitful. Avoid the spiritually deceitful. Starting in verse 3, there are a varied number of out-of-bounds behaviors that Paul begins to identify. He talks about sexual immorality, impurity, greed, obscene and foolish talking, crude joking, all of these things. The sexually immoral, impure, greedy, idolater, all of these things. Now, understand that he's not giving an exhaustive list of behaviors, but all of these behaviors fall into a singular category, which is what? Sin. And so he's listed all of these sins, and the intention is not to say, hey, it's only these behaviors that are bad, it's only these things that are out of bounds. Rather, I believe he is giving an example, a list of behaviors that are out of bounds that characterize sin in general. And with respect to those, he says in verse 6 what? He says, make sure that let no one deceive you with empty arguments. Well, empty arguments about what? He says, because God's wrath is coming on the disobedient because of these things. My hope is that you don't want to be deceived about anything. You know, I don't want anybody to pull the wool over my eyes about anything. I don't want to be tricked. I don't want to be fooled. Hopefully you don't either. We are told in verse 6, listen, let no one deceive you. Don't let anybody pull the wool over your eyes about what? He says with empty arguments. What's an empty argument? It's an argument that may sound reasonable, but actually is not valid. But what again are we talking about? What is he encouraging me to guard against? Bear in mind, he has just described all of these sins. And it's not an exhaustive list. He's talking about sin in general. And he says, I want you to guard yourself against an empty argument because God's wrath is coming on the disobedience because of these things. What's he saying? He's saying that there are people and there are those that will tell you these things are actually okay. That God is somehow okay with them and that these behaviors are actually acceptable. And he's saying don't be deceived by that. Don't be fooled. Don't be tricked or snookered by that. And so there are those in the 21st century, as it has been, in truth, in every century, all the way back to the first when this was written, that have sought to make the case to argue for the fact that things that God has labeled to be and identified as being out of bounds are actually okay. But in truth, that's something that's been around since sin came into the world and goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. Do you remember what's going on with Eve and Satan in the Garden of Eden? Do you remember that Satan first comes to her and he says this? He says, did God really say that you can't eat of every tree in the garden? She's like, well, God said there's this one that we need to stay away from. That tree in the center we're supposed to stay away from because he said in the day you eat of it, you'll die. And do you remember what Satan said? He said, you will not die. And then he says, the only reason that God is trying to keep this from you is because he's trying to keep something good from you. He doesn't want you to understand the difference between good and evil. He's trying to keep that from you. So this is actually okay. And so going back to the beginning of the story of mankind, we have Satan seeking to deceive Eve and then Adam with this notion that things that God has said are actually out of bounds, that they are okay. That was going on in the first century when Paul wrote Ephesians 5. It was going on before time began in Genesis chapter 3, and it's still going on in the 21st century. And if you do not see this, if you are not aware of the fact that this is going on, I have no idea what it is that you are paying attention to. We are operating in a culture that is seeking to redefine the most basic elements of human existence. We have modern academia intentionally and overtly seeking to tell even the youngest among us that gender is not binary. We have an insanely aggressive LGBTQRST YV agenda that is being advanced to the point where this. I don't know if you saw it the other day. There is now a new Lego set that is a gay pride Lego set. Who's that targeting? It's targeting your kids. It's targeting your grandkids. The city of New York, its Department of Education, was defending this week its continued use of Drag Queen Story Hour. Tell me that there is no agenda and you are a fool or a liar, but it can't be anything other than those things because that is going on. Aggressively and intentionally, we are operating in a culture that is saying what God has said is not right. He is wrong about this. And God used Paul to say this, don't be deceived by it. Eve was deceived. There were people in the first century, and unfortunately in the 21st century, there are still so many that are being deceived by it. And if you allow yourself to be deceived, who you are as a follower of Christ effectively gets to be hijacked so that there is no difference and you don't look anything different than someone that has no connection with Jesus. If you don't want your spiritual identity to be stolen, make sure that you do something. He says, as this is going on, do not partner with them. This does not suggest that you are to be rude and uncivil, that you are to be curt, but it is to realize this, that you and I have a limited amount of time, and we have a limited amount of space in our life for important influences. And there are spheres of my existence, and I want to make sure that those that are in closest proximity to me, I want to make sure that I guard that. And I want to make sure that the people that have my greatest attention, the voices that I'm most listening to, are not the ones that are telling me that God is actually wrong. A few months ago, I had decided that of course, TV landscape has changed so much with how you, for some period of years now, you had traditional cable and there's so much streaming and stuff that's going on. I wound up signing up for a plan with Spectrum. It was called like TV Choice. And how it works was that you pick 10 channels of your choosing from almost all the channels they have. So you pick 10, and then you get your local channels, and they said the charge, I'm talking to them on the phone, they said it's like $21 and change a month. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good deal, because truth be told, even if you have 1,000 different channels, you probably don't watch more than about 10, plus the locals. And so I decided I'm going to do this. Well, about the same time, though, and I didn't ask for Spectrum to do this, I just got notified that they were going to quit sending me a bill in the mail and that I was just going to get an e-statement. And I had for some time been on an automatic draft with them, and so when that email came, I just didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. And so I'm doing this for some period of months when I happen to I'm looking at my bank account, and the Spectrum charge that comes across, I think, is a little too high, because I'm thinking it should be like $21. Instead, it's like $30-some, and it's right much more. And so at that point, I logged into my Spectrum account, and I want to see this actual bill. And so I see there's this $21 charge, but then there's this charge, this $9 local broadcast fee. Like, what? Now, you told me, you specifically told me that this plan is $21, you pick 10 channels of your choosing, and you get the locals. Well, you do get the locals, except they charge you $9 to get them. Do you have a choice to get them? No. We just get them. We're able to just charge you an additional $9. And so what did I do? That day, I called Spectrum and I canceled. I said, listen, you can't tell me that a product is $10, and then I go to the cashier and you say it's $19 because it includes the packaging. That's essentially what you have done. And so I have decided I don't want to do business with you on this. I don't want to operate with someone that is going to be telling me, oh, it's actually this way, when it's actually not. The charge is not $22 a month. The charge is $33 a month. Plus, you're going to add your taxes to that. So no, what you told me is not correct. And so we're going to end this little relationship. Now, we do that with cable companies, but the reality is we need to also do the same thing oftentimes with people. That doesn't mean, again, that we are to be civil or uncivil or we are to be curt and hateful, but we need to make sure that those who have the greatest opportunity to speak into our lives, that we are not allowing the voices into our minds or giving attention in our thought to those that are going to say to us what God has said is actually not correct, because that person will deceive you. That person will lead you astray and effectively have who you are as a follower of Jesus, your spiritual identity, effectively stolen. I need to make sure that I evaluate who I imitate. I want to make sure that I avoid this spiritually deceitful. And the last thing I want to do is this. I want to expose what sin does. I want to expose what sin does. In verse 8, he says this, "For once you were darkness, but now you're light in the Lord. Live as children of light." Verse 10, he says, "Testing what is pleasing to the Lord." Verse 11, "Don't participate in the fruitless works of darkness, but instead what?" He says, "Instead, expose them." All right, so he's saying that as a follower of Jesus, I'm not operating in spiritual darkness, I'm operating in spiritual light. And operating that way produces some different behaviors. It produces things like he describes in verse 9, goodness and righteousness and truth. And as someone who is a follower of Jesus, it ought to be that I'm interested, according to verse 10, about doing the stuff that God is actually pleased by. It ought to matter to me that the stuff that I'm doing in my life, that God, that puts a smile on His face. And then he cautions against, in verse 11, about participating, he says, in the fruitless works of darkness. Now, what are fruitless works of darkness? Well, works of darkness, that's a euphemism for sin. But then he describes it as fruitless, which is to say that it produces no meaningful, no actual positive benefit. And so instead of participating in it, what does Paul say to do? He says, expose it. But he says, expose these fruitless works. You're exposing the fact that it is actually fruitless. What does that mean? Let me describe it for you this way. I believe that what it is that He's wanting me to do, that He's wanting you to do as a follower of Jesus, is that as we are living our lives, it's not simply that we are not engaging in the behaviors that don't characterize those that have experienced the difference that Christ can make in a person's life, but beyond that, that we are exposing what sin actually does. Now, what does that look like? I saw on Facebook the other day an ad. It's a meme of an old cigarette ad. Maybe you've seen this one. It was an ad for Chesterfield cigarettes. I don't even know if those are still made, but I don't know what decade these were done, maybe the 50s or 60s, but this particular one had a picture of a young boy on it, and the caption said, "Remember Mama and Papa for Mother's Day, Father's Day, and every day." With what? With Chesterfield cigarettes. So little Johnny, little Susie do what? Go buy Mommy and Daddy cigarettes. Right? Be thoughtful. All right? There was another one for Viceroy cigarettes that had a picture of a dentist on it, and it said, "As your dentist, I would recommend Viceroys." And then maybe you remember seeing the old Camel cigarette ad that says it's the one that doctors recommend more than any other brand. It's like a vitamin, right? So for decades, these ads were going on, and the extent to which those things actually had an impact, I don't know. Happy Mother's Day. Here's a carton of cigarettes. I don't know the extent to which that influenced people. More recently, though, I've seen some ads that I thought were much more impacting and had greater consequence. There was one, maybe you've seen it. It was a lady, and she wasn't particularly old, but she looked a lot older. But she was difficult to understand because she'd had a tracheotomy, and she has to put her finger over the hole at the base of her neck because she has had cancer, and that's the only way you can understand what she says. And she's got this horribly robotic voice, and she says what? "This is what smoking did to me." What's she doing? Well, she's saying, hey, this is what it actually does. This is what it actually does. And I believe in that ad, it showed later that this person died not long after that ad was actually created. What are they doing? They are exposing what this actually does. Listen, at the end of the day, we are operating in a culture that is telling people that out-of-bounds behavior, stuff that God has said, you shouldn't do that, do these things, it's really not bad, that God's okay with it, doesn't really make any difference. And it's not simply that we ought to be saying, listen, that's not the case. These things are actually not good. These things are actually bad. But that we expose the fruit of it. Say, this will damage your character. This will damage your reputation. This will ruin your family. This will decimate you financially. This will decimate you physically. We need to be sharing with people the ultimate consequence of what sin actually does. And chief among them is that it separates me from the one who made me. In the end, what God is using Paul to say to believers, to those that are the followers of Jesus, listen, God has changed you. Even your identity as a follower of Jesus is different. And you need to make sure that you safeguard that difference. Don't allow that identity to be stolen. Make sure, intentionally choose, evaluate who you imitate, avoid the spiritual deceitful, and then expose what sin does. And as you're communicating with others, this is what it actually does. That constantly reinforces to you. It reminds you of what it could also do to you so that you will safeguard yourself. So that in the end, your spiritual identity is not stolen. There are names that you are familiar with who have effectively, by virtue of their choices, allowed their spiritual identity to be hijacked and stolen. In the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, it was Jim Bakker and Jimmy Swaggart. More recently, it was Carl Lentz with Hillsong Church in New York. Even within the past year, once the death of the famed apologist Ravi Zacharias came out, was discovered that he was effectively living a duplicitous life. And these individuals, what they are known for now, what stands out in the minds of people, what they are identified for is what? These horrible choices that they have been made because their identity as a follower of Jesus, because of the choices they made, because they didn't evaluate and guard who they imitated, because they did not avoid the spiritually deceitful, because they didn't expose what sin does, that's what they get known for, not being a follower of Jesus. Listen, I want to make sure that nobody gets a loan today in my name. I want to guard my financial identity. But far more than that, I want to guard my identity as a follower of Jesus. The question is, do you? Will you bow your heads with me? Everything that we've talked about today is contingent on something really important, and that is having experienced a relationship with Jesus. Actually having begun one where you've been brought into His family. You've come to know His forgiveness. You've come to experience the change that He can make in a person's life. Can you say that you've experienced that? Can you say, Michael, I've crossed the threshold of that? I know without doubt that I have experienced that. If the answer is no, or I'm not sure, we will allow us to help you with it. If you're here, as soon as this service is over, will you talk to me? Will you talk to Jamie? We want to share with you how you can experience this. We can pray with you now, but it's going to take more than just a few moments to have that conversation. We want to help you. If you're watching online, will you reach out to us? Our contact information is showing up, and we would love to be able to spend some time with you. Set up a time. We can talk on the phone. We can talk in person. We can do it however, so that you can experience what it is that you need to know to come to know the real, eternally consequential difference that Christ can make in the person's life. But if you've already crossed that line, if you've already experienced that, Christ has done some amazing, some great things for you. Some wonderful things have changed. You've been adopted into His family. You've been made an heir of God. You've got a new self with new desires, headed in a completely different direction. But listen, you and I can be operating, and we can be making choices that allow all that to effectively be stolen. So let me just ask you, this past week, the past 2 weeks, as people evaluate your life, when they try to pick out the influences in your life, where does Jesus rank on that list? It ought to be that as His follower, He is the defining difference maker in my life. And if there is anyone that I'm seeking to emulate and live my life after, it's trying to follow His lead. If that's not the case, will you talk to Him about it now? Will you be honest with Him about the choices that you've been making that have been out of bounds? Maybe there's some people in your life that have been dragging you down. There's some influences and people that have voice to your mind and heart that are leading you not closer to God, but they're leading you further away. Maybe it is that the Holy Spirit is saying, listen, that needs to change. Doesn't mean that you've got to be mean and hurtful to them, but you're going to have to change the nature of that relationship. Maybe it is that what you have been doing is you've just been kind of silent. You're surrounded by people that are engaged in behaviors that you know what God has said, you know how damaging it is, you know how destructive this is. And God's showing you, you need to be bold enough. You need to seize opportunities that He provides to share with them the loving truth. This will destroy you. Listen, as God is speaking to you, as He's showing you things that need to change, will you just talk to Him right where you are? If you want, you can come and kneel at this altar. If you want one of us to pray with you, we can do that. But as He's speaking to you, will you speak now to Him? Lord, every one of us here today knows that at some point, sooner or later, our time on this earth is going to end. And there's things that we're going to be remembered for, things that are going to be standouts about our lives. Lord, I hope among those that say that they know You and have a relationship with You, the thing that should stand out most, that if no one knows anything else about us, that what we would want them to know is that we knew and followed You. Lord, if that's not the case, it's possible that we have been making choices where our guard has been down and our identity as one of Your followers is getting yanked away from us. Yes, it is true that we've got an enemy that's working against us, but sometimes we are our own worst enemy by the choices that we are making. And so, Lord, as You're showing us things that need to change, relationships that perhaps need to pivot, some voices that need to be turned down, some conversations that need to take place, Lord, I pray that we will follow Your lead. And that in the end, if we're known for anything, that we're known as people that know and walk with You. So, Lord, thank You for speaking to us today from Your Word. And I pray that we have not simply been hearers of the Word, but going forward, we are doers. That's our prayer. We ask it of You in Jesus' name. Amen.